So, Joel, welcome back to the Crypto Princess channel. How are you today?
I'm doing great today. It's Friday. Life is good. Bitcoin's on sale today, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Joel, we're going to be talking about a subject that's quite important to me and you. It's something that we're already doing, but it's about making what makes Bitcoin the ideal asset to hold as generational wealth. So let's just dive straight into it, Joel. What makes Bitcoin the ideal asset to hold for generational wealth?
I think scarcity is the first thing that comes to my mind. And I think that if we really explore what people think about when they think about generational wealth, because we're kind of at the stage right now, it's 2025, early 2025. There's a lot of baby boomers out there who maybe retired a couple of years ago or thinking about retiring. They've basically seen their generational wealth, or what they thought was generational wealth, pretty much evaporate because of the money printer. Every dollar that the governments print, it makes our dollars worth less. And I'm kind of going through it myself in my own family, where my dad retired a couple years ago, and I never thought that he would have to think about money ever again. He worked the same job for 40 years. He had a really good pension. And because they printed about 40 or 50% of the total monetary supply that has ever existed before in the last couple of years, what they thought was generational wealth turned out to be the opposite of that. And people are kind of fearful with what's going on right now. So when we think about generational wealth, I think about like storing your time and energy in a battery. That's what you want to do. You want to preserve your time and energy in a battery. And to me, Bitcoin's the best battery that exists because it doesn't have any leaks in it. And so if you think about gold, if you think about land, if you think about other assets that people might want to hold for a very long time, they all have leaks. That's how I look at it. So if you think about gold, number one, gold has been around for thousands of years. It's done a very good job. And I think if you compare any other asset to it, it's really held its own through the years. But the problem with gold is that it's very centralized, number one. And two, if gold shot up to, let's say, $100,000 an ounce next week, we could just go and find more gold. I think one of the biggest illusions that we've been told is that gold is super scarce, and that, some other commodities like oil is also super scarce. And I think that both gold and oil through these years, they're very abundant. And we might have been tricked somewhere along the way to think that these were scarce assets, but they're not that scarce. If you look at the Grand Canyon, there's some conspiracies around that. There's mountains. We mentioned before the show an asteroid maybe full of gold. There's a lot of gold out there. And I think even like objectively, you can look at the fact that both China and El Salvador discovered very large deposits of gold in the last couple months. In El Salvador, they found a couple $1 trillion worth of gold. I feel like El Salvador is like the size of my backyard here. So that's just like one very small part of the earth, and they found a couple $1 trillion worth of gold. So how much gold is really out there? We don't know. We can't verify it. And irregardless of that, the new supply is about 2% increase every year. So when we think about, let's just compare it very simply to gold. The market cap of gold right now is about $20 trillion. The market cap of Bitcoin is about 2 trillion. So when you look at these two assets side to side, they have quite a few characteristics in terms of the being able to hold its value, in terms of everything you look at. The only thing that Bitcoin is missing there is time. If you look at any chart comparing gold and Bitcoin, the only thing that Bitcoin lacks is time. And so we're 16 years into this thing. I think that Bitcoin is much more valuable than gold today, and especially the world that we're moving into, very high tech. You can send Bitcoin anywhere around the world. You can send $1 billion worth of Bitcoin to somebody for a couple dollars in a couple minutes. And it's far superior to gold in every aspect. So if we look at gold as like what was the best way to store your generational wealth, Bitcoin's an upgrade to that, and it's significantly undervalued right now. So I could go on for probably a full hour talking about why it's generational wealth, but I think the scarcity aspect is it's something we've never seen before in the world. We've never had an asset like Bitcoin that has absolute scarcity. And I don't think we've even seen the implications of that play out yet. in terms of how scarce this asset is. Because we're only 16 years into it, and because there's only about 1% of the population who owns Bitcoin, and even less who actually understand what they're holding.
So with Bitcoin, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins for the whole of humanity for all time. Tell us, how is Bitcoin divided?
It's divided by, so actually Satoshis is kind of how we measure it. So Satoshi was the anonymous creator of Bitcoin. And so I call them sats, but they're called Satoshis. And within every one Bitcoin, there's 100 million Satoshis in that. So as Bitcoin continues to grow here, I think that that's what people will be more focused on. And I kind of have this theory that when Bitcoin gets to $1 million per Bitcoin, that means that one Satoshi or one sat is going to be equal to 1 cent. And I think that that's when people are really going to shift their mindset around Bitcoin. Because right now, when you go to buy Bitcoin, it says you get like 0.0001 of a Bitcoin. Whereas when we make the shift to sats, people are going to be like, wow, I can get 100 sats for $1 here, or I can get 1,000 sats for, $5 here. It's going to completely change people's mindset around it and the unit bias that comes with Bitcoin right now, because people see it as too expensive right now. I've talked to countless people in the last couple months who say, I would have loved to get into Bitcoin, but it's $100,000 right now. And I just, it's too expensive for me, or it's too high. But when you look at it as Satoshis, today you can get 1,000 Satoshis or more now because of the price drop for $1. And I think that for me, one of the things that's really stuck with me is like, it doesn't really matter what the price is. Just get as many of these Satoshis, these scarce, finite units, while you can, while there's still enough uneducated people out there who are willing to trade their dollars for Bitcoin still. Because one of these things people can print more of. We have no idea how much there is. We have no idea how much there's going to be next week. And one of these is verifiable, how many they are. It's bound by energy. It has countless characteristics within Bitcoin that really separate it. So as long as people are still willing to trade their fake dollars for Bitcoin, you should absolutely take that deal.
And if we compare Bitcoin to fiat money, how does that measure up?
I mean, it's not even close. That's kind of what I'm getting at here, is that because the world still doesn't really understand what Bitcoin is, you have to really, just take a step back here and say, like, the people who spend time in Bitcoin, the people who have spent time and energy learning about Bitcoin, the more they learn about it, the more excited they are about it. And I think for the average person, there's a huge disconnect there between, somebody like me or like you who have spent time in Bitcoin, countless hours, thousands of hours trying to understand this thing, versus somebody who's just kind of taken in secondhand information there. So that's kind of what I said, that the majority of people are still very uneducated about Bitcoin, and they're still willing to trade a completely fake illusionary asset for Bitcoin. So as long as people are still willing to accept my dollars for Bitcoin, I'm going to be buying forever. But in terms of like the actual difference between the two, Bitcoin is better in every single aspect of the dollar. And I really believe, I have this theory that if you did a blind test and you didn't put any word, like any titles on the page, you had one page here and one page here, and it showed the characteristics of the fiat dollar and the characteristics of Bitcoin, but you didn't put dollar and you didn't put Bitcoin on it, I would say that like 99.9% of people would choose Bitcoin as the better asset, something they would want to hold and store their time in. But because Bitcoin carries this really negative connotation around it, and they see the price being $100,000, they just don't take the time that they need to understand and understand why they should be holding it right now. So the differences are endless. Bitcoin's better in every aspect of it. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I think about it, obviously.
And what about Bitcoin versus real estate?
Bitcoin versus real estate. That's a really good one too. So when I was talking about like the battery and storing time and energy, historically, that's what real estate has been used for people not to live in, but because of the devaluation of their dollar, they want to invest in real estate in hopes of, maintaining that purchasing power that accrued. So real estate, again, has held up pretty well. It actually has underperformed gold in a lot of ways in terms of, purchasing power. So when you think about like the real estate market for the last 20 years and you say, yeah, it's gone up quite a bit. It's gone up maybe 8-10% on average a year, but that's losing to gold and that's losing to Bitcoin. And I think that as people figure this out, a lot of that capital is going to flow from real estate into Bitcoin. And because there's only so much Bitcoin available, that's when things really start ramping up. And that's kind of what I'm saying here when I say that 1% of people own it, less than 1% of people understand it. But the shift is happening right now where people are starting to understand it more. So if you're holding a piece of real estate as an investment, not to live in, but as an investment, it has leaks because not only do you have property tax every year, not only do you have insurance on the property, you have maintenance. And I've owned real estate myself as like I had a rental home. And for me, I was just like, I was making money every month on it. And I think that a lot of people who hold real estate for that reason do make money. But it's like you accrue these gains every month as a tenant or a landlord. But then in 10 years from now, you got to replace the roof. So everything that you kind of made through these last 10 years, now you got to put back into it. And it doesn't increase the value by putting a new roof on it. That's just something that needs to be done to it. So real estate has all these different leaks. Plus, you have tenants. You have somebody that could call you on Christmas Eve and say that their basement flooded. There's all these different concerns. And when somebody leaves, you have to, take a lot of your time and replace that person and find the right person for that. It's just a whole headache. And so if you can get the same kind of, store of value from this without all the headache and without the leaks, I think that that's a no-brainer. Plus the last part here, I think that a lot of people miss is just how liquid Bitcoin is. So if I'm holding real estate and I'm using it as collateral and I go to the bank and say, I have this piece of land or this rental house, I want to take out a loan against that. Think about it from the bank's perspective, because their job is to make sure that I'm still making my loan payments every month. I went to the bank, I use this real estate as collateral. They trust that I'm going to make my payments. But if I stop making my payments, they have to sell that property, sell that land or sell that house. And think about the process it takes. You have to find a realtor, you have to find a lawyer, you have to get the banks involved, you have to find a buyer locally for that real estate. It could sit there for a couple months or a year while the bank's trying to get their money back. But when you compare that to Bitcoin, if I stop making my loan payments, the bank could just sell some of my Bitcoin today, like within 5 minutes, and they could make that loan payment for me. So it's very liquid. It has a worldwide market of buyers who are wanting to buy Bitcoin versus something that's local, like a house or land, where you have to find somebody locally to buy that from you. So comparing the two, in my mind, is not even close. And I think that what's going to play out here over this next decade is that intelligent people are going to start to realize that as well. So that's a $500 trillion market that's going to flow into Bitcoin. Not all of it, but a lot of it, that people aren't living in the houses, that's going to flow into Bitcoin because it just makes so much sense.
And how have the gains already been with Bitcoin? Because I know already people have already made generational wealth. So what's the past performance of Bitcoin been?
Yeah. So again, going back to why people are scared to get into Bitcoin right now is because they think it's too expensive. And if we look back, I mean, the first couple of years within Bitcoin, so 2009, 2010, all the way up to like 13, probably were just a complete crapshoot. Like there was hardly anybody who's using it. The mining schedule, the new supply schedule was 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. It was crazy. But if we just kind of look back 10 years and take out the crazy part of Bitcoin, it's been about 60% per year. And so I think that when you're looking at your wealth and your portfolio, and you have to factor in Bitcoin doesn't have any leaks in it. So whatever you have today, if you store that properly, it's going to be there in 50, 100 years from now. There's zero leaks there, which is, a big part of this thing. But it also has significant performance. But so 60% for the last 10 years, I think, is the compound growth rate on Bitcoin, 60%. There hasn't been anything even come close to that, from gold to real estate to the stock market to anything. Nothing has outperformed Bitcoin over that time. But the thing that I hope that people will understand here is, again, this is the third time saying it, but 1% of people own Bitcoin. A very, very small percent of it, of that, those people actually understand Bitcoin. And so that means that there's still 99% of the people who have to show up, or who are still to show up here. So yes, we've seen 60% per year on average, but I don't think that's going to slow down in the near future. I think it's going to ramp up, especially for the next decade, as we go through this part of the S curve where it becomes mainstream. It's in everybody's phones. Everybody's starting to kind of understand it. That's when we move to, who knows? There's really no cap on Bitcoin. And I think it's also something that people have a really hard time wrapping their head around, is that there's no ceiling on Bitcoin. There's price predictions. There's, it could go to 1 million. There's no limit on how high Bitcoin can go, because there's no ceiling on Bitcoin, because there's no floor on fiat. There's no floor on how much money they can create, how much more debt they can take on. There's no end to that. And Bitcoin is just going to continue repricing everything in that old system until we're kind of flat. But I think we're a long ways away from that. So if you're looking at this asset and saying, I've missed the gains, I don't think that they've really even started, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. So last year, if we look at 2024, last year, a lot of legitimacy was given to Bitcoin with the approval of the Bitcoin ETFs. Could you tell us, what is a Bitcoin ETF and how has that changed Bitcoin's setting in the financial markets?
So an ETF, I don't know what it even stands for. Electronic fund transfer, maybe? I don't know. I don't think that's right. But it's essentially where an entity like BlackRock, they can buy Bitcoin, they can hold it themselves, and they can basically sell shares for that Bitcoin. So it was a very big deal. And I think that when we look back in a decade or two from now, January 2024 was going to be kind of like the catalyst, where you have the Larry Finks here. You have public companies like MicroStrategy who have really ramped this up. You have countries now talking about it. But the ETF, I think, more so than anything else, it just provides a very easy highway for these large pools of capital to have exposure to Bitcoin. Because if you look at who's holding the ETFs right now, it's companies who can't hold Bitcoin, essentially. And that's why MicroStrategy has gone up so much, is because these are the vehicles that allow these big pools of capital to have access and exposure to Bitcoin. Because if you think about it, some of these state pension funds, some of these bigger banks, they have certain rules and regulations that they can play in. And a lot of their rules and regulations don't include Bitcoin in there. They can own ETFs, they can own equity, they can own bonds, they can own all these other assets, but Bitcoin's not included in that. And so what the ETF does is essentially packages up Bitcoin and makes it available for these people to buy. And it's been very popular. If you look at the inflows into the ETFs over this last year, I think it would blow a lot of people's minds in terms of just how much they've been able to accumulate. I think they're close to 1 million Bitcoin, if not more, in the last year. So to me, these ETFs, MicroStrategy, I kind of see those as like a canary in the coal mine here, because it suggests that all of these big players around the world, they want Bitcoin. They can't buy it yet. They can't hold Bitcoin yet, but they're using things like the ETF and like MicroStrategy to access it. And they're willing to pay a premium on it. If you look at MicroStrategy, which is basically like a glorified ETF for people to kind of understand it. They're a public company who holds Bitcoin. They're a Bitcoin treasury company, or strategy they're called. They've completely revamped their business around Bitcoin. But people are willing to pay 2 or 3 times the Bitcoin that they hold just to have access to those shares. So all this big money is coming in here. It's going in as fast as it possibly can right now. And I think if the average person really understood that the richest people in the world are doing everything that they can to own this asset, that's a pretty good indication that you should probably, try to get as much as you can before it's very easy for them. And that's coming.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So can you explain to us what OTC is, the amount of Bitcoin on OTC, and what would happen to the price of Bitcoin when OCT is depleted?
So OTC stands for over the counter. So when people are looking at buying Bitcoin, you got a couple different options there. You could log on to like a Coinbase account. You could log on to like a Bitcoin Well account. And pretty much what happens there is it's just kind of like a software. It's code. It's high frequency. You're sending your dollars there. They take your dollars gladly, obviously. They tell you that you have Bitcoin. It's just really a big slush fund, though. If you look at Coinbase, if you were to send them $500 today and buy Bitcoin on Coinbase, it's not an actual Bitcoin transaction. They're just holding some dollars. They're holding some Bitcoin. When you go to withdraw it from there, that's when it's an actual Bitcoin transaction. But with over the counter, uh, it's basically you get to talk to a real human being. That's how I like to explain it. It's Bitcoin that's not moving around on the exchanges. It's actually like if I wanted to buy some Bitcoin from you or from an over the counter, I would pick up the phone and say, hey, here's an order for 1 Bitcoin. Can you fill that order? And the human on the other end would say, yeah, we have this amount of Bitcoin. We'll send it over. Whereas when you're dealing with Coinbase, it's all kind of just done within a software program or, behind the scenes using technology. So that it really ties closely to the exchange rate. The Coinbases, the Bitcoin Wells, that's what kind of measures it. But when you're talking to another human being over the counter, it's a different kind of transaction there. So how does it affect the price of Bitcoin? Both the exchanges and the over the counters, once these start drying up, I think that because of the scarcity involved with Bitcoin, if you understand very basic economics, the demand is going up, the supply is going down, the price can only really move in one direction when that happens. So very simply, as these exchanges, both the Coinbases and the over-the-counter start to dry up, we're going to see some very steep and significant price increases, I think, because there are 21 million Bitcoin that will exist ever, but I think there's much less than 2 million Bitcoin that are actually available for people to purchase. And when you think about it in these terms, like there's 63 million millionaires in the world, 63 million millionaires. And let's say that there's 2 or 3 million Bitcoin available. So that just shows you that, everybody has this, if they can't get 1 Bitcoin, they're kind of out of it. But just understand that every single millionaire on the planet, even if they wanted to, they couldn't even get 1/3 of a Bitcoin right now, or it might even be much less than that. So don't ever get caught up in like trying to get to 1 Bitcoin. And if you can't get to 1 Bitcoin, it's a waste of time. Just understand that there's a lot of millionaires, the majority of millionaires on this planet who will never be able to afford 1 Bitcoin, which is crazy.
But OTC as well, I think a lot of institutions buy from there as
Yes.
well.
Yes. Sorry.
So
I forgot to mention that. Go ahead. Yeah.
So once that's depleted, the institutions are going to be forced to buy from the exchanges. And isn't that going to skyrocket the price of Bitcoin?
Yeah. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. Again, we're kind of going through this whole thing. I don't pretend to be a Bitcoin expert because I don't think that any Bitcoin experts exist yet. We're only 16 years into this thing. There's never been an asset like this before. So we're just kind of seeing for the first time everything play out in real time. So I don't know what's going to happen with the over the counters when they dry up. I think that that's going to have a huge impact on the price, as you mentioned there, because that's how these, the bigger entities in the world, that's what they use to buy their Bitcoin. They're not logging into Coinbase and buying $100 worth of Bitcoin here and $1,000 worth of Bitcoin there. They're moving like tens or hundreds of millions around using these over the counter exchanges. So one of the things that kind of bothers me about the exchanges and the Coinbases of the world is that, like I said there, when you send money to a Coinbase, they just hold it in a big slush fund. And I think very similar to like a bank, where if everybody tried to go to the bank and withdraw their cash, the bank wouldn't have enough cash. I don't think that anybody would argue with me there. And I think that Coinbase and these exchanges, they kind of do the same thing, where if everybody tried to withdraw their Bitcoin from Coinbase, I don't think that they would have the amount of Bitcoin that they claim to have. So one thing that I'm kind of looking forward to in the future here, because of Bitcoin's characteristics, it's very transparent. And so I think we're going to see a trend in the next couple of years, hopefully, of like these bigger entities showing their proof of reserves, not just saying how much Bitcoin they have and us being able to kind of guess, but like showing, here's what we have, here's the addresses that Bitcoin is in. And I think once we start seeing the proof of reserves kind of become standardized and normalized, that's when people are really going to understand the true scarcity of this asset. We haven't seen it yet, but I think that once these big companies and governments and states are forced to show proof of reserves, I think people are going to really understand how scarce this asset is. So yes, that's a really good point in terms of when they dry up, what kind of impact this is going to have. Because imagine the over-the-counters run out of Bitcoin, and Saylor wants to buy 15,000 Bitcoin next week. Where does that come from? Because where we sit right now, if you actually looked at the ownership of Bitcoin at this time, individuals own 70% of it. People like me, people like you, people who are watching this, there's people with obviously large amounts of Bitcoin, but 70% of 70% of the Bitcoin is owned by individuals. So as these big entities, these governments, these public companies start to, understand that they need Bitcoin, it's not just something that's there, they need Bitcoin. They're going to have to get it from us. And so what does that look like for somebody who's holding Bitcoin? It means that you pretty much get to set the price. And if you're anybody like me, and I think that there's a lot of Bitcoiners out there like me, but my price to part with all my Bitcoin right now would be much higher than $100,000 or $80,000. Much, much higher, like maybe 100x, maybe 1,000x from here. And so as those exchanges dry up, they're going to have to start looking to us to sell it. And if I'm not willing to take less than $100 million from my Bitcoin, understand what that's going to do to the price. Because again, absolute scarcity, we've never seen an asset like this before. The demand is going to continue to rise. I think even somebody who doesn't understand Bitcoin would probably agree with me that, the demand for Bitcoin is probably going to grow here. So it's going to create this incredible dynamic over this next decade. And I have no idea what's going to play out. It wouldn't surprise me if it went to several million. It wouldn't surprise me if it went to 10x that. So I'm kind of just ready and willing for anything. And I take an approach of being a buyer, not a seller. So when the price is down, that's when you load up on more sats. And I think that if you're thinking about this generationally, that's what you want. You want an asset that's going to continue to grow in demand. You want an asset that nobody can print more of. And you want an asset that doesn't have any leaks in it. And when you're thinking about holding this asset for the next 50 or 100 years for your kids and their kids, Bitcoin is the only thing that facilitates that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when we think about scarcity as well, we keep saying there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoins for the whole of humanity, for the whole of time. In that, there's already been, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there something like 2 or 3 million Bitcoins have already been lost?
Yes. I think they estimate it to be about 3 or 4, maybe even 5 million. I think it's more than that too. I know a handful of people in my own life, and I'm one person out of 8 billion. I know quite a few people who have lost Bitcoin, lost the keys to their Bitcoin because they bought it when it was running up and they weren't really prepared for how to secure it. And they lost that Bitcoin. And that's definitely not being factored into their calculation of the lost Bitcoin. But yeah, like even if it's 2 million, when you start looking at this asset objectively, like forget all the stuff you've heard about it, forget all the negative press that it's had. You have to understand that Bitcoin was created to separate money from state. It was created to get rid of the central banks, which have kind of been a poison in our system for the last 111 years. So what the media does, what the governments do, is they throw all this information at you to try to scare you, to try to make you get you to look somewhere else, because they understand that if everybody knew what was going on here and how important this asset is to humanity, there'd be a lot more interest in it. And so if you look at this asset objectively and you say, okay, well, there's 21 million that will ever exist, 19.5 million of that has already been mined. There's this company who owns 500,000. There's this wallet that has 1 million in it. There's this BlackRock that owns 500,000 and going more. You start to see that, okay, there's really not that much Bitcoin left for the rest of humanity here. So when you see that and you look at it again objectively, very objectively, you see that this thing's pretty scarce. And even if I have like, I don't know, 100,000 sats, a million sats, if you hang on to that and you have the conviction in Bitcoin, that's going to set you up and your family up for a very long time. And that's how people should be looking at this. You should never buy Bitcoin with the intention of selling it in the near future. Every single person who buys Bitcoin should hold on to that for at least 4 years, and beyond. Like I have a part of my Bitcoin that I'll never move, or that I'll never benefit from. That's for my family. That's going to be there forever. It's in a UTXO. It's never going to move. I'm never going to be tempted to move it. It's just going to be there. And again, it's going to be there if you secure it properly. I don't have to pay a fee to anybody. There's no property tax on it. There's no insurance on it. If you get to that stage where you can protect this asset, it is going to be there for as long as you need it to be. And there's no other asset on earth that you can say that about.
I mean, it's the same as because we've already discussed this. My Bitcoin, I'm never going to sell it. I'm actually going to keep it for my great grandchildren, minimum. So I'm probably even going to skip 2 generations. If my kids don't really understand what Bitcoin is, or their children don't understand what it is, I'm definitely going to skip generations and actually give it to my great grandchildren.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm going to be the Bitcoin granny.
They're going to have a statue of you somewhere.
Oh, I hope so.
But that's kind of how I feel in Bitcoin too. There's a lot of people like you, and there's a lot of people like me who aren't thinking about this for ourselves. And if there's 2 different ways that I look at this right now. If you're somebody who's like 20, 25, the world looks pretty scary right now. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of hope for anybody out there. Whatever money you take in, you have to spend right away just because things cost so much. There's no way to store it properly. It doesn't really exist. But with Bitcoin, it is hope. It's hope for the future. And I think that there's a lot of people with that mentality who are like, okay, I understand this. I understand that this is just going to keep going up in value over time. And I want to leave this for my family because we never had access to this until Bitcoin, something like this. And so we are the people who are here right now. There's going to be people born in 50 years and will have given anything to be where we are right now and have the ability to buy this amount of Bitcoin for this amount of dollars. And it's crazy when you start thinking generationally like that. It really changes your perspective and your mindset around everything. You look at things a lot differently, and it is a shift. It's a complete mindset shift from the fiat world, very short term focus. Get as much as you can while you can. Where Bitcoin, it's like, I'm going to just keep adding value to the world. I'm going to learn how to store this, and that's going to be there forever without me having to pay anybody or pay any fees or anything to look after. If you do it properly now, you're going to set your family up for generations to come. And there's nothing else that you can do that with.
No, definitely. I completely agree with that. Okay, so moving forwards, and now America, and not just America, many other countries are now looking to implement a Bitcoin reserve, giving the class even more legitimacy. But what are Bitcoin reserves?
So the government's historically, there's been a lot of confusion around this, and myself, I'm a little bit confused as well. There's the strategic Bitcoin reserve. There's the national stockpile of Bitcoin. There's states buying it. Without getting lost in like the terminology or what it is, it's basically just like the government understanding that this is an asset that's probably going to be around for a while. Some of the other things that we were talking about aren't necessarily going to be. And so when governments are starting to look into Bitcoin to hold as a reserve or a stockpile, they're thinking about the future, which is something that we haven't really seen a whole lot of within government and within politics. When people, they get nominated and voted into these positions, they usually have about 4 years, and they try to do as much as they can in those 4 years. And then it's somebody else's problem. But I just love the fact that there are politicians out there. I look at Cynthia Lummis as one. I look at Bukele in El Salvador. I look at Donald Trump as being one, and Trump's team. They're buying Bitcoin now, even though it's going to be, kind of a short-term negative look for them probably. But in 20, 50, 100 years from now, the US citizens, if this goes through, they're going to be very thankful that that happened. And I think that the thing that really blows my mind about it is like the US, the most influential government on the planet, is talking about doing this. And I really think that they're probably going to do it in the next 6 months in one form or another. And when they do that, you have to understand the implications of what's going to follow from there. Because you got China, you got Russia, you got India, you got the UAE. These are all very powerful forces that are competing to with wealth, with the money. That's who controls the power and the influence. And so they look at the US and say, well, the US is buying Bitcoin. What are we doing? So again, going back to our scarce list of Bitcoin and who has it and who's going to be able to hold it, think about the countries. Think about the US. They want to get 1 million Bitcoin. If there's 2 million Bitcoin available and the US gets 1 million of that, what's left for Russia, for China, for India, for all these states too? It's just, it's going to be very, I want to say interesting, but it's so beyond that, because I just think that people are really having a hard time understanding how few Bitcoin there are and how few Bitcoin these countries are going to be able to have. Like I look at MicroStrategy right now, who has 500,000 Bitcoin. I don't think anybody's going to be able to outdo them. I don't think anybody's going to get past that, whether it's the US government, whether it's Russia, anybody. I think we've kind of peaked. I don't think anybody else is going to get higher than that. So when you understand the implications of that, if this thing works out like we think it's going to, a public company called MicroStrategy is going to be the most influential entity on the planet. So it's exciting to me knowing that, we're here now, born at this time, understand it, and we're able to kind of front run what's coming here. And if people knew what was coming, I think that they would feel a lot differently about Bitcoin. They would just do everything that they can right now to get as much as possible, regardless of what the price is, regardless of how much they get, just that they get as much as they can. I think that that's the most important thing that people can be doing right now, because this is coming. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I really think that once the US starts buying Bitcoin as a reserve or a stockpile, whoever owns Bitcoin at that point, they're going to look at their balance of Bitcoin and they're going to say, I got 50 million sats or I got 20 million sats. When the US starts buying Bitcoin, that's pretty much going to be the peak that they have, because it's going to cost way more to exchange dollars for sats at that time. And even if they go up a little bit, it's not going to be a sizable amount. That's pretty much going to be the pinnacle of how much Bitcoin they have. When these countries start buying Bitcoin, it's pretty much game over for the average person. And again, I think that if people understood that, they'd be acting with a little bit more urgency with this.
Yeah, no, definitely. As the bill stands currently, and it hasn't been passed yet, America is thinking of buying 200,000 Bitcoin every year for the next 5 years, totaling 1 million Bitcoins in total. They're thinking of keeping it for a minimum of 20 years, and it can only be used to pay America's debt. Russia's come out to say that they're looking at a Bitcoin strategic reserve, but we also do know that both Russia and Iran bought Bitcoin in 2018. So behind the scenes, these countries are already buying Bitcoin. Tell me about El Salvador, because they're ahead of the bunch, aren't they? What are they doing?
El Salvador, I think that they have about 5,000 Bitcoin. They've been pretty much buying 1 Bitcoin a day for the last couple of years. If you look at their website, and that there's a couple things I want to talk about in regards to El Salvador. They're doing some really exciting things. They were kind of the first country to really embrace Bitcoin, and I think that it's going to pay off extremely well for them in the future. But a couple of things about El Salvador that I really appreciate. Number one is that they have a website where you can go to and you can look at their Bitcoin balance. You can look at their transactions, their purchases, very transparent. And kind of what I was referring to earlier in regards to proof of reserves, they're already doing that. They're kind of leading the pack in terms of being transparent with their Bitcoin holdings and the addresses that the Bitcoin's in. So imagine that. Imagine moving away from a world that we live in now where we send all of our tax money to the government. We trust that they're doing the right thing with it. I think the majority of people have figured out that they aren't necessarily doing the right thing with it. But there's zero transparency. No government that I can think of has ever been audited before in terms of the money that they take in, how they spend the money, how much money they actually have. Whereas now with Bitcoin, because of its transparency and because of its, it's basically a public ledger, you can set this up and you can say, yes, here's our Bitcoin holdings. This is the address. And I think that as more and more countries start adopting Bitcoin, I really believe that currencies are going to start to be backed by Bitcoin, where El Salvador will have their Bitcoin balance, they'll show it, and people can kind of buy El Salvadorian dollars based on how much Bitcoin and how much is backing their currency there. So that's where I think we're moving to. I think that El Salvador is going to be the pioneer in that industry, or that in that situation. But the other thing that really cool that El Salvador is doing right now is they're using their natural resources to mine Bitcoin. So they've made significant investments in the last couple of years to utilize their natural resources. And the cool thing about it is it's actually a volcano. So that's what El Salvador is using right now to mine Bitcoin, is a volcano. And this is also going to be another big trend in the future, is utilizing natural resources instead of human resources. So the way that governments historically have funded themselves for the last 100 years anyways, is that humans go to work, they provide value to the world, and they send money to the government. That's how governments have been funded, human resources. But with Bitcoin mining now and the technology that we have, we're actually able to capture natural resources. So just think about that for a second. Like there's a volcano there it's there. It's doing what volcanoes do. It produces a lot of heat. And so instead of just letting it sit there and produce heat, you hook up a Bitcoin miner to that and you actually utilize that energy and you convert that into money. Bitcoin's the only thing that has ever existed where you can convert natural resources into money. You could convert natural resources into money eventually, but you'd have to find a buyer for that energy. You have to sell that energy to somebody. With something like this, you can actually just take that volcano in this case, and you can convert that directly into money. Not just money, but like very liquid money that you can sell, you can hold, you can do whatever you want with it. And so I think that that's going to be a trend going into the future, is that governments are going to be funded more from, let's say, tariffs and natural resources versus human resources and income taxes. And I think that something that Trump has been talking about is getting rid of the income taxes. And people are like, how is that possible? But with natural resources, you convert that energy that's otherwise just there into Bitcoin. And that's how you fund government. Hopefully governments look a lot smaller in the future, but I think that's how it's going to play out.
So we've spoken about Bitcoin, why Bitcoin is an excellent asset to hold as generational wealth. We've spoken about its scarcity. We've spoken about the legitimacy now that Bitcoin has, because before it was more seen as like drug money or something in the black market. Well, institutions are coming in, the ETFs, governments are buying Bitcoin, they're looking to buy Bitcoin. We've just spoken about El Salvador. Moving forwards, when we're looking at retail, people like us, and we're thinking about holding Bitcoin for generational wealth, what would you say to the person who's going to turn around and say, look, Bitcoin, I in 2016, I could have bought it for $400 US. Now it's, the best part, or over $100,000 US. It's too expensive now. So what would you say when somebody looks at the price of Bitcoin, or when they think that they're too late to get enough Bitcoin to make a significant generational wealth bag, if that makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of the first, I don't know, half hour of this conversation, we've kind of been talking about, why it's, even though it's grown significantly in the last 16 years, why I don't expect it to slow down. And if you have a very basic understanding of economics, and just maybe for the people out there who, haven't maybe seen me before or watched me on the show or whatever, like I was an accountant before, I was a CPA and I minored in economics. But the thing about Bitcoin is that once I understood Bitcoin, I realized that everything I learned in school was wrong. But there were certain takeaways from it, and that was a big shock to me after spending close to a decade in that world, realizing that everything I learned was wrong. But in that world, there's a very simple supply and demand equation there. So when you think about Bitcoin, you think about the demand, first part. So the demand for Bitcoin, I think that, again, most people would agree with the fact that this is still very early. There's still a lot of people. This is the future. Let's say that Bitcoin is the future. Most people would actually agree with that, even though they don't understand it. And that's kind of what's holding them back from buying it. But they would agree that Bitcoin is probably going to be a big part of our future. So with that, you think that the demand is probably going to rise. More and more people are going to want Bitcoin. More and more people are going to start to understand it and maybe hold on to it a little bit longer. So as the demand continues to rise, the supply doesn't change. The supply is going to continue to go up 1% a year, and then 0.5% a year, and then 0.25% a year. That's the beauty of Bitcoin, is the supply schedule. So we talked about 21 million being, that will ever exist. 19.5 million of that has already been mined or put into circulation. And so for the next 110 years, I think it is, there's only 1.5 million Bitcoin left to be mined. So what does that tell you? The demand is going up. Supply is pretty much not going to change for the next 100 years. Like, it's going to go up a little bit, but not in a significant amount. So if the demand's going up, supply is staying the same and kind of going down, the prices can only move one way in that scenario. So I think the only way that this thing would go down from here is that if the demand for it fell, if people stopped using it, if governments decide they weren't going to buy it anymore, if strategy started selling some of their Bitcoin, the demand might actually go down. But if you think about it even like this, if the demand flatlined for the next 100 years, if it's only us 1% of crazy people who own Bitcoin, even if that stayed flat and the supply going down, the price will still go up over time. And I think once you get to a certain point within Bitcoin, you realize that the price doesn't really matter that much. The only thing that matters is how much Bitcoin you have. That's in 10 or 15 or 50 years from now, speaking generationally, your grandkids are going to look at you and say, how much Bitcoin did you get during that time? They're not going to ask you how many houses you bought or how much gold you had or how much Ethereum you had. They're going to care about one thing, and that's Bitcoin. So it could be $80,000. It could be $100,000. That's kind of just the price that the majority of uneducated people have put onto this thing. That's what they're not willing to pay for it. But somebody like me who understands this asset and who has put in the time to understand it, my price is closer to 100 million. So there's a huge spread there right now. And I think somewhere in the middle there is where we'll probably land. And so if you look at $80,000 today, it's kind of like a joke. It's kind of like a rounding error compared to where we're going right now. So what I would tell people is just take what you can. You don't have to go out and get a second job. You don't have to sell all of your investments, but take like whatever you have in terms of like free cash flow, maybe sitting in a savings account. Maybe you could sell a few things around your house. Just get some Bitcoin, get some sats, and then keep learning about it. And I think that as you keep learning about it, you're just going to want to get more. And that's the way it should go. The more you educate yourself, the more you understand it, the more you can start pulling from your pension. You can start maybe selling a rental house for it. You don't do that right off the bat. You don't just jump into this thing. You get a little bit, you continue learning about it, and then you'll see why you're going to want some more of it.
And that was actually my next question. So for anyone who's watching this, they're new to Bitcoin. How do we actually buy Bitcoin for generational wealth?
So are we talking about like security here, or like how do you go about buying it?
How would you DCA? Would you lump sum? Would you wait for the bear market?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you look at kind of where we are this moment right now, we're at $80,000. So in the last couple of months, we ran up to, I think, 110, and we dropped down to 80. Bitcoin's very volatile when you're looking at this thing like week to week, month to month. Over the long term, though, it has gone in one direction, which is up and to the right. But if you look at kind of where we're at right now, what I would tell somebody who might not have any Bitcoin yet, but you're getting a sense of maybe I should get some Bitcoin, I would just take whatever you have, like in terms of if you got $500 in a savings account or any sort of investment account that you can easily access and convert into Bitcoin, I would do that today. If it's 10% of your portfolio, probably don't do that. Start very small. Get what you can today. Like do they call it a smash buy, but that just means like you take whatever you have and you buy Bitcoin with it. From there, once you do that, and the reason why I started with 80K is because I think that we're probably going to go up from here. So get as much as you can. You don't want this thing to run away from you. In a couple months from now, it might be 100, it might be 150. You're going to get less Bitcoin for the money that you have right now. So just take what you have, put it into Bitcoin. And then from there, that's when you set up like a weekly buy. Maybe you do like $20 a week. Maybe you do $10 a week. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you're just doing it. You're getting Bitcoin, you're getting sats. And so kind of smash buy first and then DCA into the future. And then, if you get a bonus from work, if you get a tax return, you can dump it into Bitcoin. But start with what you have, get as much as you can, and then just do it consistently every week, every month, as much as you can. Mm-hmm. And it compounds. I think that's one thing that people really need to understand is the power of compounding. And you might buy some, you might be DCAing here for the next dollar cost averaging for the next 6 months, and it might not seem like you have that much, but do that for 4 years, do that for 10 years, do it very consistently, and don't even look at the price. Just every time, the same time every week, the same time every month, convert some dollars into Bitcoin, and just watch what happens with that. Use compounding as your best friend. Just forget about everything else, get as much as you can, and do it very consistently.
And over the long term, DCA has never failed.
Correct.
DCA has never failed. It can fail in the short term, but over long term, and we're talking about generational wealth here. So we're talking about maybe, Bitcoin is the only crypto that I would never take profits on. It really is. I have an altcoin bag for that. And then just quickly, George, just before you go, how does one store their Bitcoin for generational wealth, and what security measures should we be looking at?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it really depends on number one, your age. I know this is going to be like a long-winded answer, but it really depends on your age, and it really depends on your understanding of Bitcoin. So if you're, let's maybe start with the baby boomers, because that's who is probably thinking more so about generational wealth than anybody else right now, is the baby boomers. So if you look at Bitcoin and you're just kind of like, you kind of understand that this is the future, you want to get some, you don't really know how to do it, I would say the best thing that you can do is probably just buy the ETF. You'll get exposure to the price of Bitcoin without having to worry about doing something wrong or losing the Bitcoin or losing the keys to your Bitcoin. You can buy the ETF probably today, and you can still have the price appreciation of Bitcoin. And then over time, kind of what you want to do there is you want to shift it to self-custody, where you actually own that Bitcoin. Somebody else isn't holding it for you. So I'd say for baby boomers out there, you got two options. I would say if you're somebody who's, you don't really have a whole lot of time in Bitcoin yet. First one is the ETF. You can just call your financial advisor today and say, hey, move $5,000 from Apple to the ETF or MicroStrategy. ETF, I think, is a better bet for most people, though. It's much less volatile. The second option, though, is you can use an over-the-counter. We talked about OTCs earlier. You can use an over-the-counter exchange like Caleb and Brown. I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, but they've been around for about a decade now. They built a lot of trust within the Bitcoin and crypto industry. And so what you can do there is you can actually call them, talk to a real human being, which I know baby boomers very much appreciate. And you can say, I want to send $10,000 over and buy Bitcoin. So they'll help you facilitate that transfer. Plus, the nice thing about an OTC or an exchange like Caleb and Brown is they'll actually hold it for you for a little while. So they don't hold the Bitcoin themselves. They have a third-party custodian called Fireblocks, which is also a very reputable company within Bitcoin and crypto. But then you can you send them some dollars. they hold on to it for a little while you kind of get your feet underneath you. Maybe you watch some videos, you read some books, you get some help from friends. And then when you're ready for it, you can just pick up the phone again and say, I want my Bitcoin. So they'll help you, they'll help send it from them to you. Kind of once you have a little bit better understanding of it, you can do that in chunks. You can maybe wait a couple months, get 50%, wait a year, get another 25%. But the nice thing is that it's going to be there. And I think that one of the issues I have within Bitcoin is that there's a phrase that says, not your keys, not your coins. And everybody thinks that they kind of have to do that right off the bat. And that's honestly where most people lose their Bitcoin, is when they try to do things too quickly. They buy too much of it. They don't know what they're doing yet. And then they lose it because they don't understand the process and the responsibility and the process of storing Bitcoin. So that's kind of what I would say that. But, I talked about baby boomers there, but that's pretty much anybody who has like a sizable amount that they want to put into Bitcoin. I would say get the ETF or get an exchange that can hold on to it for a little while. But then the beauty about Bitcoin is that it is the only asset I believe that you can truly own. And I think that that's one of the very unique characteristics of Bitcoin, is that you can actually own this asset. And you might say, well, Jor, that's dumb because I own some gold and it's in my basement and I own it. But if you think about it like this, somebody breaks into your house with a gun tomorrow, you don't own that gold anymore. Whereas with Bitcoin, if you do it properly, you can actually disperse the access to that Bitcoin in different locations, different countries, while still maintaining ownership of it. You don't have to have any of it in your house. You can either keep it in your head, the 12 words to your Bitcoin, or you can disperse it across different parts. So that's what I would say, is like really embrace the fact that you can own this asset. It is an asset that you don't need permission to use. It's an asset that you can hold and know that nobody can take it from you if you do it properly. And I think given the current climate that we're in right now, that's a pretty important characteristic of an asset. And going into, another asset that people would say that you can own, think about land. People are like, well, Jor, I have land. That's mine. I own it. But try going a year or two without paying the property taxes on that land and see if you really own that asset. So we've kind of been just tricked into thinking that we have ownership of assets until Bitcoin existed. So it is very unique in the sense that you can own it without anybody being able to take it from you. And there's many different things I can talk about in that respect. But for people who are, I'm guessing the majority of people who watch your channel are already familiar with crypto, with Bitcoin. And I think we should probably talk to them for a couple minutes here. But if you are somebody who's already understanding that you should be taking ownership of your Bitcoin, kind of my guidelines that I tell people is like, if you got 1 million sats or 0.01 of a Bitcoin, that's when you should take it off the exchange. So if you're using like a Coinbase or something, once it gets more than 1 million sats, that's when you move it into a wallet. You can use like your phone, you can use your laptop, move it off the exchange and into your own wallet. At 10 million sats, when you got 0.1 of a Bitcoin, that's when I usually tell people that they need like a hardware device, like a cold card or something like that, that actually takes it into cold storage and takes it off the internet. That's 10 million sats. And then if you got half a Bitcoin or 50 million sats, that's when you should start looking into like a multi-sig setup where you kind of eliminate yourself as the single point of failure, where if somebody did break in your house and held you at gunpoint, because of the way you have it set up in different spots, they can't do anything with that. So don't really think about Bitcoin like half a Bitcoin is like $45,000 worth. Like think about that as like $50 million worth of wealth, because that's what it's going to be worth. And don't wait for it to become that. You have to be kind of proactive here and take steps towards doing that slowly, but surely. And then, if you got a Bitcoin or more, that's when you should be doing like this. You should be getting into a multi-sig tomorrow, and you should be looking at ways to encrypt your backup keys. There's a whole slew of things that come once you get to that point. And there's a lot of different things to think about. So that's why I kind of advise everybody to just really go slowly with this. Don't get too far ahead of your skis. Understand what you're holding. understand the need to secure that, but don't try to do it after watching a couple of videos on YouTube. Really take your time, understand what you're doing, because you kind of get one shot at this for protecting your Bitcoin. You know, it could be gone like that. And so you should be taking every single step possible to make sure that that Bitcoin is going to be there for the generations. You know, it doesn't really matter how much Bitcoin you have if you're not securing it properly, because the goal for this is to secure it for the next 50, 100 years. And you have to build a foundation right now. Think about like a house. You know, you look at an old house, and I'm sure that you'd see much more older houses than I would in that area of the world. But the reason why houses last for hundreds of years is because they have a really solid foundation. And that's kind of the time that we're in right now, where we need to be building that foundation. And once that foundation is solid and sound, then you can build as much as you want on top of it. Whereas if you just kind of shortcut that and your foundation's weak, you could stack as much Bitcoin as you want on top of that, but it's going to fall down. You're going to do something wrong. You're going to make a mistake, and you only get one shot at it. So make sure that whatever foundation you're putting in place right now, it is the best that it can be, but do it slowly.
Awesome. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Joel, for coming back onto the channel and doing this little segment with me. I really enjoyed it.
That was a quick hour, wasn't it?
It was really quick.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate what you're doing in the space. I think you're going to have a couple pretty exciting guests for everybody in the near future. So I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, and I can't wait to come back again.